Marco Rubio looked at America's closest allies and told them the Strait of Hormuz is not America's problem anymore. Not in a classified briefing. Not through back channels. To the G7, the most powerful economic bloc on Earth. The same nations that built the post-war order alongside Washington. The same nations that have hosted American bases, shared American intelligence, and aligned their foreign policy around the assumption that the United States would show up when it mattered. Rubio told them to handle it themselves. Washington would help, but the burden was on them. And in that single statement, something that had been quietly cracking for months finally broke open in public. While he was saying that, the Houthis had just launched ballistic missiles at Israel from Yemen. A new front, a second choke point, a proxy that spent weeks on the sideline waiting for precisely this moment and received the order to activate. Between the Strait of Hormuz and the Strait of Bab el-Mandeb sits roughly a third of the world's traded oil. Not a detail. That is the entire story. And the country that spent decades projecting naval power through both corridors just told its allies to figure it out on their own. Oil is at $114 a barrel and climbing. The S&P 500 is at a 232-day low. Mortgage rates are heading for record highs. And Donald Trump was at a podium in Miami cracking jokes about renaming a waterway after himself. In the next few minutes, I am going to show you exactly how we arrived at this moment, walk you through 3 receipts that reveal the true architecture of what is being built in real time, and explain why Rubio's statement to the G7 is not a footnote. It is the hinge point on which the entire post-war order just swung open. Drop your answer in the comments. Is this burden sharing, or is this abandonment dressed in diplomatic language? Let us rewind the clock. This did not begin with Houthi missiles arcing over Israel. It began with a decision, a coordinated U.S. and Israeli decision to strike Iran's industrial backbone. Specifically, 3 of Iran's largest steel plants, facilities responsible for roughly 70% of Iran's steel output. Steel is Iran's second largest export category, valued at over $6 billion annually. That was not a military target. That was an economic decapitation attempt. Iran's foreign minister made the calculation public. He stated that Israel, acting in coordination with the United States, had struck 2 of Iran's largest steel factories, a power plant, and civilian infrastructure. Then he added the line that should have triggered alarms in every situation room on the planet. Iran will exact a heavy price for these crimes. The Houthis had already laid out their 3 activation conditions publicly. Any new alliance joining the U.S. and Israel. Use of the Red Sea to carry out attacks. Or continued escalation against Iran and allied groups. The steel plant strikes checked that 3rd box. And then the missiles flew from Yemen. Not randomly. Not impulsively. On a specific geopolitical trigger, executed with precision. That is not a militia reacting emotionally. That is a network operating on a predetermined schedule. Now let me show you the 3 receipts that tell you exactly where this is heading. Receipt number 1. The Houthi activation and the second choke point. The Houthis did not enter this war by accident. They waited. They signaled publicly for weeks that they were armed and ready. They stated their conditions out loud. And when those conditions were met, they moved. This is the first time they have officially entered the conflict, shifting from declared readiness to active combat operations. And here is what makes this so structurally dangerous. The Houthis already proved during the earlier Red Sea disruptions that they possess the capability to functionally shut down one of the most critical commercial waterways on Earth. The Strait of Bab el-Mandeb is not a geographic footnote. It is the southern gate to the Suez Canal. If the Houthis turn their attention from launching missiles at Israel to blockading that strait the way they disrupted Red Sea shipping before, you are looking at a second choke point crisis layered directly on top of the Hormuz shutdown already strangling global energy markets. 2 choke points. 1 war. Roughly a third of the world's traded oil caught between them. Nobody in the administration gamed this out at this speed. The activation was predictable to anyone reading the public statements. The conditions were stated openly. The network was visible. And Washington walked into it anyway. Receipt number 2. The Riyadh strike and the casualty truth. While Trump was hosting Saudi business leaders in Miami, Iran launched a ballistic missile strike against a U.S. military base in Riyadh. At least 12 American soldiers were injured, 2 seriously. A separate incident from the previous week involved 14 additional personnel at the same or a nearby facility. The total injured now exceeds 300, a figure that, given this administration's documented pattern of minimizing casualty disclosures, appears likely to be conservative. The head of Iran's parliament stated it plainly. How can the United States, which cannot even protect its own soldiers at its bases, protect anyone else's soil? That is not rhetoric. That is a strategic message aimed at every U.S. ally hosting American forces. And the Pentagon's silence in response was not restraint. It was an admission that no answer exists. Receipt number 3. The Hormuz toll system and Rubio's surrender. This is the most consequential development of this entire conflict and the one receiving the least coverage in proportion to its significance. Iran does not merely control the Strait of Hormuz. Iran is operating it as a toll booth. Countries aligned with Iran or willing to negotiate bilaterally pay a fee, and their tankers pass. Thailand recently completed a bilateral negotiation and has been moving tankers through on a pre-approved route. Countries allied with the United States or refusing to negotiate, their ships do not move. 25% of the world's oil exports flow through that corridor every single day. Iran has converted the most critical energy choke point on Earth into a revenue-generating checkpoint and a diplomatic instrument simultaneously. And then Marco Rubio stood before G7 leaders and told them the Strait of Hormuz is not America's problem anymore. He said European allies need to handle it themselves. Washington would help, but the burden was on them. Pause on that for one moment. The country that projected naval power through that strait for decades, that built the entire petrodollar architecture around guaranteed passage, just publicly told its closest allies it has no answer for what Iran has done. That is not burden sharing. Burden sharing happens before the crisis, when everyone agrees on the architecture together. What Rubio described is something else. It is a superpower discovering in real time that its leverage over a critical waterway has been transferred to an adversary, and telling its allies to negotiate with that adversary directly because Washington cannot solve it. If this analysis is connecting dots you have not seen assembled anywhere else, you are already ahead of most people watching this unfold. Hit subscribe right now. This is accelerating faster than any single outlet can track, and you need to be here when the next chapter drops. Now step back and look at the contrast, because this is where the real picture snaps into focus. Iran responded to this conflict with force and a spreadsheet. While the Trump administration focused on bombing steel plants and declaring victories from podiums, Tehran was quietly building a network of leverage points that no single military strike can dismantle. Iran activated the Houthis at the precise moment of maximum strategic impact. It seized the Strait of Hormuz and converted it into a bilateral negotiation instrument generating revenue. It launched coordinated strikes across multiple Gulf states simultaneously, demonstrating regional reach the Pentagon publicly underestimated. And it laid out non-negotiable terms that tell you exactly where it believes the leverage sits. Keep the ballistic missiles. Keep Shahid drone production. Reserve the right to enrich uranium. Full reparations for war damages. Security guarantees for all allied groups, including the Houthis and Hezbollah. Removal of American military bases from the region. A formal apology. Those are not the demands of a regime on its back foot. Those are the terms of a power that believes time and geography are both working in its favor. And what is Washington doing in response? Trump has been caught multiple times claiming productive conversations with Iran that Tehran publicly denies. He manipulated markets with deal talk that evaporated within hours, twice in 1 week. By Friday, markets had gone numb. You cannot move a $114 barrel of oil with a social media post. While soldiers were being injured across the region and markets cratered, Trump was building golden archways at the White House, hosting financial conferences in countries whose bases were being struck, calling the Strait of Hormuz the Strait of Trump. And his Secretary of State was telling the G7 the Strait was no longer America's responsibility. You do not fight a multi-front war with ego and construction projects. You need a strategy. And the evidence of one is absent. So, what does this mean for you? Oil at $114 is the floor beneath every price in your life. Gasoline, heating, groceries. The S&P at a 232-day low is retirement accounts and hiring plans being repriced simultaneously. And once Thailand's bilateral deal with Iran is visible to every energy-dependent economy watching, the calculation changes. South Korea watches. Japan watches. Every country calculates whether its strategic relationship with Washington is worth being on the wrong side of that toll booth. Once those arrangements form, they do not unwind. The new routes become the new normal. The architecture of global energy does not reassemble around Washington simply because the shooting stops. Where does this go from here? 3 paths. Scenario 1 is managed de-escalation. Back-channel negotiations produce a framework that gives Iran enough of its stated demands to pause operations. The Houthis stand down. The Strait of Hormuz reopens under some international arrangement. Markets stabilize partially. Both sides declare a version of victory. But even in this best case, the structural transformation is locked in. Iran's toll booth precedent has been established. The Houthi activation capability has been demonstrated. Thailand's bilateral deal has been completed. The G7 has been told the Strait is their problem. None of those facts unhappen because diplomats shake hands. Scenario 2, as analysts examining these dynamics assess, is regional realignment accelerating. Other nations follow Thailand. Bilateral arrangements with Iran multiply across Asia and the global south. Gulf states hedge with increasing aggressiveness between Washington, Beijing, and Moscow. European allies, told explicitly to handle the Strait themselves, accelerate independent defense frameworks and energy partnerships that route around American dependency. The United States remains the largest military power on Earth. But it is no longer the unquestioned center of the energy and security architecture it built. It becomes one option among several. And in a world with options, the terms change permanently. Scenario 3 is the one nobody wants to name out loud. The Houthis move from launching missiles at Israel to actively blockading Bab el-Mandeb. 2 choke points close simultaneously. Oil surges past $150. The Marine Expeditionary Units, the 82nd Airborne, and the carrier groups now converging on the region are used in a ground operation. Iran responds with everything it has not yet deployed. Casualties mount beyond any number the administration can manage narratively. NATO fractures under forced choices no government was prepared to make. This scenario is not inevitable. But the current trajectory, no diplomacy, no coherent off-ramp, a Secretary of State telling allies to handle it themselves, a president naming straits after himself while bases burn, points toward it with increasing directness every day. Here is what I know with certainty. The relationship between American naval power and guaranteed passage through these waterways will not look the same after this conflict. Even if every missile stopped tonight, the lesson has already been absorbed by every capital watching. The United States told its closest allies to handle the world's most important energy corridor themselves. Iran proved it could charge tolls on 25% of the world's oil supply. The Houthis proved a second choke point was available on demand. And a country that built its global influence on the credibility of showing up publicly announced it was stepping back from the most visible test of that credibility in decades. When the side absorbing strikes gets stronger with every hit, when the side launching strikes gets told by its own Secretary of State that the problem is not its responsibility, you are not winning a war. You are funding one for the other side. Did Iran outmaneuver the most powerful military on Earth, or did Washington hand Iran the blueprint through its own decisions? Are the Houthis a new front in this conflict, or the front that finally makes the cost of continuing it unbearable? And when Rubio told the G7 to handle the Strait themselves, was that a negotiating position, or was it the moment the whole world understood that the old order was already gone? Drop your answers in the comments. I read every single one. Subscribe because the next chapter, Bab el-Mandeb closing, the next